All right, just wanted to give folks just about a minute or so in particular. But first of all, wanted to thank Akeisha Anderson for joining us. This is going to be such a pleasure, so I really look forward to this interview. So first of all, I'll just kind of introduce some information about Akeisha in particular, and then I'll also let her go on from there, and we'll see. Oops, excuse me. Actually, my apologies. All right, awesome. So yeah, so Keisha Anderson is she's a lawyer and lobbyist that previously served as the associate director of admissions for UCLA Law School. Her time working as a law school admission officer led her to her passion for helping first generation, low income and underrepresented minority students navigate the law school admission process. As a result, she now runs Anderson Admission Academy. And I'll post a link for you all and then also send out email as well later. And you can also find her at Ask Akeisha on Instagram. But with that being said, I'll let Akeisha kind of introduce herself and we'll go from there. Yeah.
Hey, well, thank you so much for having me first and foremost. I'm super excited about being here today. But yeah, as Solomon just said, my name is Akeisha Anderson. I am an attorney. I work as a lobbyist. That's my full-time job. I do criminal justice reform lobbying. And I used to work for UCLA School of Law. So I was associate director of admissions there. And in that role, I worked in all phases of the admissions process. So reviewing applications, managing the wait list, recruiting students, recommending scholarships, et cetera. And so I really enjoy that work and, helping students get into law school, but it has definitely informed the work that I do now at Anderson Admissions Academy, helping, a specific subsect of students get into law school. So I'm super excited to be here tonight, super excited to be doing this work, and I'm happy to answer any questions you all have.
Nice, awesome. So yeah, thanks so much, Akeisha, for joining us once again. One thing I was interested about, I wanted to see if you can kind of like go a little bit deeper into your background about, how you, from law school and then getting to UCLA as an admission officer, and then how you kind of transition into your role now from there. So then we can kind of broaden out from there.
Yeah, so I went to law school after working and being in the real world for a few years. So in undergrad, I studied sociology and I minored in business management. I did not know that I wanted to go to law school. Because at the time I actually did not want to go to law school. After undergrad, I ended up getting my master's in public administration, which is different than a degree in public policy, but it did require me to take public policy courses. And so while I was getting my master's, I realized that I had a passion and love for policy work. And so I went into law school knowing that I did not want to be in a courtroom per se. I really wanted to do policy work. I wanted to work behind the scenes. In legislative realms, et cetera. So before law school, I did have the honor of working for my US Congresswoman, the first Black Congresswoman from Alabama. I also had the honor of working for local elected officials. So I worked for the Montgomery County Commission. I'm based in Montgomery, Alabama. And so yeah, in law school, I got a certificate in government affairs and I really pursued that path of doing policy work. When I graduated from law school, my first job was doing policy work. I was at UCLA at one of their think tanks. Then we had the wonderful, and this is not to discredit anybody's political beliefs, et cetera, but we had, a presidential election and, the president that took over in 2017 that drastically impacted the type of work that I was doing. I was doing LGBTQ rights policy specifically. And I found myself in a position where the work just was no longer fulfilling. I felt like, I didn't go to a courtroom, I stated that, so I didn't litigate, but the work that I was doing, policy advocacy, it felt like the equivalent of me going to a courtroom every day and getting an L. So just losing after losing after losing, in part because there was such a drastic change in, the administration and just what policies were being promulgated, et cetera. And so that dissatisfaction at that time led to me realizing that I needed a shift, I needed a change. UCLA at the time had a job opening for a role down the hallway, the
Mhm.
admissions office. I had a colleague in the admissions realm, someone that worked in my alma mater's admissions office, who told me I would be great for the role. I had met the dean of admissions previously at just, an event that my office had hosted. And so I said, why not? So I applied for the admissions role. I really enjoyed it. And so, yeah, I did admissions for a few years, but then ultimately I did end up transitioning back to the policy realm, which is where I'm at now.
Nice, awesome. No, thank you so much for kind of like going to that. I'm actually for that. While I was looking through your LinkedIn early yesterday, it was really cool. In terms of the policy aspect, um, is that something that one thing I was interested in terms of obviously there's the role of the law and also the role of how law is sort of implemented as well. So I was curious, as a policy director, how you were able to tie those things in. Did you find that your experience as a lawyer gave you more insight, and then also too as a policy director? Did you feel that there were some things that you saw that were lacking there in terms of how limited you were if you necessarily weren't a lawyer in a sense? So I guess I don't know if that makes sense, Mike, asking.
No, it does. And so I do feel like my law degree greatly informs the work that I do. I mean, there are a lot of lobbyists that don't have a law degree, but there are certain things that I know that I'm able to do in part because of my law degree. So, in addition to lobbying and talking to legislators, I also have the pleasure of being one of the people who is behind the scenes actually drafting legislation or modifying legislation because I understand the language on the paper, which I recognize not everyone can do. And so there are definitely benefits to having a law degree and doing policy work, even though you don't necessarily have to have a law degree to do policy work, but it definitely comes in handy more often than not with me. And not only with being able to draft legislation, modify legislation, etc., but also being able to talk to a lot of my legislation. I said I do criminal justice reform work, but a lot of my legislation comes before the judiciary committees, and those are filled with lawyers. And so being able to have those conversations with other lawyers about this is unconstitutional, or in this case, a judge ruled XYZ. And so being able to have those conversations makes a huge difference. I think it makes me a bit more credible sometimes when I'm talking to legislators. It definitely helps me get a level of respect and Republican supermajority. And so it is something that really aids me a lot in the work that I'm doing.
Nice. And I was actually going to get into this a little bit later, but I guess we might as well talk about it now. And I'm interested because that's pretty cool. I guess that you're able to, like, say you kind of know the ins and out. You're writing the legislation. You're seeing how to, in terms of the implementation phase. When you're writing a law, how much do you factor that in terms of, because the way laws are written and the way they're implemented are two different things. I guess how do you factor that in? Like, we can say this, but behind the scenes it may go a different way. I'm curious.
Yeah, because of my public administration background, and I think that that is another area where I have a really unique skill set and kind of eye for things. But because of my public administration background, I am really acutely aware of the way that agencies implement things. And so, because of that, when I'm drafting legislation, I have the implementation part in mind, where to the extent that there is something that I know I want, and I do not want an agency to have the discretion to kind of promulgate a rule to kind of make the
Right,
outcome look
right.
different than I want, I know that I need to be really specific in that area. I also acknowledge that for every piece of legislation that's written, there are like 20 rules that an agency is going to promulgate as a result of it. And so knowing that, building relationships with agency actors while I am working on legislation and while I'm trying to pass legislation, knowing that that's important, is something that I kind of carry with me. And so, no, but you're absolutely right. Implementation makes a difference. I often have conversations with allies that, aren't always the things that people want to hear, but this piece of legislation is unreasonable. This is going to be really hard to implement, or like no system actor, has the time to do this. And so we need to modify this. And so I do have to have those conversations because I do recognize it from that lens as well.
Nice, awesome. No, I found that part really interesting. So I can kind of go on and on about that portion, but we'll kind of touch bases on that. One thing I was interested in as well is, you kind of talked about, I was looking at your website about how you weren't necessarily a traditional student, whatever that even means, because tradition is tradition, right? So, but I wanted to kind of leave that open to you in a sense to talk about, yourself being a quote unquote non-traditional student, and what that means to you, and then how that experience, your law school experience, and also what advice you would give to folks who also want to follow along the similar path in particular.
Yeah, so I consider non-traditional students to be those students that do not go straight to law school after undergrad. And so that definitely was the case for me. I did not go straight to law school after undergrad. And so I had some work experience, I had some lived experience, I had some things in between undergrad and law school. And so that definitely shaped my experience in a certain way. For example, by the time I got to law school, I wasn't used to being a student anymore. Like I had to get reacclimated to being a student, and not only reacclimated to being a student, but get acclimated to being a law student, which in and of itself requires so much more time commitment, and just so much more time than undergrad and law school did for me outside of the classroom. And so really getting acclimated to being a student again, being a law student particularly, was different. It was unique. I think that people that go straight from undergrad into law school probably have a bit of an easier transition. I also, because of my lived experience, a lot of the things that we talked about in class when it came to policy work, et cetera, wasn't necessarily foreign to me. I was able to kind of conceptualize it in a different way because I kind of had seen certain things from my past work experiences. And so it aided me in that way. I also think that I was a bit more mature when I started law school. And I think that many students that start law school after a few years out of school, do tend to be a bit more mature because they again have different lived experiences beyond college. And so I think those are definitely ways that being an untraditional student shaped me.
Nice. And I know, and I correct me if I'm wrong. I was looking on your website. I believe you transferred, correct? You did your 1L. I forgot the name. I apologies. And then you finished up at your university in Alabama. What was that? Because I mean, so you went from non-traditional to another. Because even transfers in law schools are even that. So I guess I was curious. What for just a general sample, you can talk about your experience, but when you knew you wanted to transfer, was that whether that was a plan, and how you'd even go about doing that, because that has to be done within your first 1L. Like, when did you start that process? So I'm just curious from that.
Yeah, so I am from Montgomery, Alabama. And so when I was choosing law schools, I really just wanted to stay at home and go to law school down the street. And so that's what I did. So I went to Jones initially, which is based here in Montgomery. And for my 1L summer, because I had, work experience before law school, when I went to apply for my 1L summer internship, I completely disregarded the fact that it said that it was for 2Ls and 3Ls. I was a 1L and I'm like, I am just as qualified. And I applied for it. And I got that position that was set aside for 2Ls and 3Ls. It was at the Southern Poverty Law Center. And I worked there for my 1L summer and I really loved it. Our legal director, Rhonda, who I work with now in another context, now that I am policy director at my organization. But Rhonda, who was our legal director at the time, she told me something that I did not know before law school. So she had a talk with me one day about how elitist the legal profession is. And that's something that I did not know. I went to law school knowing that I would do public interest work. I wasn't likely to make, all the money that people at big law firms make, et cetera. And so I wasn't necessarily, or I didn't think it mattered where I went to law school. And she told me that even in the public interest realm, lawyers are super elitist. And she told me that I was too smart to not be at a well-ranked school. And, she really just had this talk with me that just scared me. It terrified me. And so this is my 1L summer. I'm already at, my internship. So 1L has, come and gone. I did really well my 1L year. And so I was fortunate enough to be towards the top of my class. And so after this talk with Rhonda, I would say maybe June, maybe July, but it was one of the J's. She had this talk with me. And from there, I realized, okay, I'm going to take her advice. I'm going to, try to apply to another school. I still didn't want to go too far from home. And so I applied to Alabama, which is, the ranked school in our state. I heard back from Alabama in August, which makes me think that it probably was July when I applied, to be very honest. And so I applied that summer. I heard back maybe a week or two before school started. And yeah, I had to make a move very quickly from Montgomery to 2.5 hours away to Tuscaloosa. And so fortunately, I knew some people in the area. I had some friends who helped me with the transition. But yeah, it was an unexpected transition and it was an unexpected move, but it came as a result of that conversation.
Nice. Wow. What a story. And I was going to ask a follow up to that. Before I ask that, just to clarify. So the whole process from knowing when you wanted to transfer took about a month and a half, two, or it might, is that
Yeah, it was somewhere between 1 month to 2, so it was not
okay?
more time than that. I definitely had not,
Interesting.
pre-planned it or anticipated it. It was not premeditated, at all, so it wasn't something I was anticipating my 1L year.
Nice. Awesome. And you talked about you doing very well your first year. And I see here that, you done well throughout your university from being magna cum laude at Alabama State and also to being a summa cum laude at Auburn University for your master's program. I was curious for law school, what would you say some tips you can give to myself and other people who are participating in law school in terms of how to study? Because we understand it's very different from what I understand, right, from undergrad. So what are some advice you can give in terms of how you studied, how you were able to implement that, and how you were able to be successful?
Yeah, so when I started law school, pretty much every law school has an orientation of sorts. And so at our orientation before 1L, I remember a professor told us that every day outside of class, we would need to commit about 12 hours a day to studying. And I took that seriously. And so every hour that I could, I was studying. I did do something you're not supposed to do your 1L year, and I do not recommend that anyone else does this, but I actually continued working with Montgomery County Commission. And so I had a job my 1L year. And because I had a job, there was a part of me that was terrified, very terrified that I was going to fail out because one, you're not supposed to work your 1L year. Two, I know how stressful, or I knew how stressful 1L year was, and I probably shouldn't have been working, but I did. I had a job. And so because of that, I probably overcompensated by studying more than the average person. And so I do admit I kind of had a dependency on energy drinks, which I do not recommend either. I recommend that you don't work. I recommend that you just spend your 12 hours studying when you can. But because I did work and have had other commitments on top of school, I really got little to no sleep because I was always studying. I was always like outlining cases, etc. And so there is an easier way to do it than what I did, but I admittedly always had a book in front of me whenever I could.
Gosh, wow.
Yeah.
And I'm curious about that because I guess you said you would have kind of did things differently. In terms of the settings, I know there's the IRAC, there's the issue, the rules, all that stuff like that. Did you your first semester? Did you, because I guess you quote unquote overcompensated, but I guess it works for you, right? Because you've been overcompensating from undergrad, say for your master's program, and you're very successful. So I want to overcompensate just like that in particular. I hope I can. But I guess I'm curious, like coming in, did you find success your first semester, or was it by the second semester you kind of knew, okay, this is how I do things? Or coming in, you were able to kind of, it clicked right away?
Yeah, so I did really well my first semester. And so surprisingly well. I think the only class that I was scared about, the one class that I didn't think I was going to do well in, surprisingly, considering I work in this realm now, was criminal law. And so I absolutely hated that class, to be very honest. I realize now that the reason I hated it was because there were not any discussions about racial disparities, and that is something that I care a lot about. And so there was a part of what we were learning that just felt disconnected to me, and like in terms of practicality. And so, but anywho, criminal law was the one class that I struggled with, but beyond that, I was doing relatively well in all my other classes.
Nice. And we had a question from the chat. So someone asked, in your professional opinion, is it wise to do a dual program with a JD PhD or a JD MA?
I would recommend it. I actually wanted to do my JD PhD, but I was schooled out at the point that I, was getting my JD. If I weren't older and just ready to like be done with school, I really would have gotten a JD PhD. What I do think is beneficial is with a dual degree program, you get to complete the degree in less time than if you did them separately. And so even if you do a JD master's program, instead of spending 5 years total, like I did in law school in your master's program, you can complete both, knock them out in 4 years. And so that is actually really beneficial, is kind of accelerated in that way to where some of your classes that you're taking for the law degree count for your classes for or count towards your master's degree credits and vice versa. And so I definitely recommend that if you are interested in doing something that's interdisciplinary, that you do consider getting a dual degree. I think it's definitely worth it. I think I definitely lean on my master's degree just as much, if not more, than my law degree in my day-to-day work. And so it definitely is beneficial to have 2 degrees. Yeah.
Awesome, thank you. And before I transition out, I just want to one thing I was going to ask, I guess on this topic of degrees as well as also academic performance. Is there any advice you would give to people just in general entering law school in terms of the best ways how to study or those aspects in particular?
Yeah, something that I started doing towards the end of my first semester that really freed up time for me. Instead of briefing cases, so typing everything up, I got to the point where I would just color code my highlights in my books. And so, for example, yellow is the rule statement, blue is the reasoning, green is the analysis. So, whatever it was, I would kind of color coordinate, which meant that I could read cases the night before, be prepared for class, and then save my outlining for the weekend, for the weekend. That helped me a lot in terms of saving time, but it also helped me in the sense that by the time I got to outlining and actually typing something up, the professor had already gone over, the parts that were important to know about any given case. And so I also had enough to where if I was cold called, I knew where to turn in my book. I knew the information. But yeah, so that's something that helped me. I don't know if that helps everybody, but that's something that helped me. Something else that really helped me was staying true to my study style. I think that in law school, a lot of students study in groups, and that is perfectly fine if that is your way of studying. I am an introvert. I don't do well studying in groups. I need to kind of be able to process internally, and kind of just study on my own in a bubble. And I really appreciate that I was able to tell my friends and peers, like, hey, it's nothing personal. I kind of just need to study alone. And they understood that I didn't lose friends as a result. And so what ended up happening was I found my group of people who also enjoyed studying by themselves. And we would just sit in a classroom together silently and like not talk and kind of just do our own thing. And so just respecting your own like method of studying, I think is really important, because I do think that sometimes in law school, students feel pressure to kind of
Mm.
have the study groups or make the friends, keep the friends, etc. And so they study in a way that isn't natural to them. And if you're not studying in the way that's natural to you, the way that worked for you in undergrad, the way that worked for you before law school, it probably isn't going to work for you in law school. So I think that's really important.
Nice. So that kind of made me curious. Do you find, I guess, that carries over to the workplace in particular, being able to say like, hey, this is my work style as well, and also communicating to coworkers, nothing personal, this is the way I operate. Yeah, I'm curious about that.
Yeah, so that's my work style as well. And so when
Yeah.
it comes to like having group conversations or brainstorming and doing like coalition work, etc., it really helps that those things typically are scheduled for me. And so if a colleague wants to like discuss like what we're doing and what an action plan is for something,
Right.
we will schedule it. And so that way I have time to kind of again internally process, come up with what I think is a good plan, and then bring something to present when we do have like our meetings and our get-togethers. But yeah, the same thing applies in the workspace for me.
Nice, awesome. No, that's really cool. Thank you for your answers with that. So yeah, so I guess sort of transitioning. So we are obviously an LSAT centric program. So I'm just curious. So for you, just in general, using your background, obviously for as a previous admission officer as well as just now in terms of the role of law, public policy, et cetera. What role would you say your LSAT score plays in terms of scholarships?
Yeah, I would say it plays a huge role. Both your LSAT score and your GPA together um, make up what I refer to as your hard factors. And you all have probably heard that term before, but your hard factors are essentially anything quantitative. And so your hard factors, I say, make up about 70% of an admissions decision, as well as they make up a significant part of, your scholarship determination. And so
Mhm.
scholarships are often given out to students who have at least one number at or above the median of a school's GPA, median GPA or median LSAT score. But the higher your GPA, you usually don't have any control over. Your GPA is what it is. Once you get to your senior year of college, you can't really change it at that point. But your LSAT score, you do have a level of control over. You can, improve your LSAT score over time, etc. And so that's the number that students usually can play with, or it can fluctuate. And so that can make a huge difference in terms of scholarship determinations. But you definitely want to have at least one of those numbers at or above a school's median to even be competitive for scholarships. And to the extent that you have both numbers, the more competitive you're going to be, or the higher that one of them is above the median, more likely the more competitive it is that you're going to be for scholarship considerations.
Nice, nice. You touch on one of the excuse me, the question I was going to ask next, which is about being above medium. Does that also pertain to the 75th percentile as well? Is there like a difference in terms of scholarship offer people who beat the medium and people who beat the 70? And I know it's not an exact science, so you can feel free to.
Sometimes, not always. So it depends on the rest of your application package. So sometimes when students are above the 75th percentile, there is going to be this push to like really get them into the school. But that's not everyone. Sometimes when people are above the 75th percentile, there may be signs that indicate that the student, maybe considering the school like their safety school, and they wouldn't come here anyways. And so instead of offering them like a bigger scholarship package, maybe that goes to someone else. And then there are students whose numbers are at or above the 75th percentile who for whatever reason have red flags in their application. Maybe their letters of recommendation didn't say the best things about them. And so it's one of those things where I want you for your numbers, but I don't really want you for any other number or any other reason. So I'm not really going to offer you the best scholarship package because holistically you aren't really the most ideal candidate, but your numbers are great. And so there are a few things that kind of come into play as in addition to your numbers when it comes to scholarship determinations too.
Right. No, that makes sense. And I guess I should have, my apologies. I should have sort of clarified my question, which is obviously, as you said, to be more competitive, right? It's not an exact science. You want to be above the medium in particular. So I was curious is that if there's even more advantage, I'm guessing, to being above the 75th percentile when it comes to scholarships. And I guess from what you're saying, obviously every case is different. There is probably some advantage, but it also depends on your applicant profile as a whole, I'm guessing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, all right. Just wanted to clarify that. And I guess sort of on the same topic as people, this is this is sort of the meat of the topic most people want to know, which is, so for example, people who are, like I say, splitters. When I say, I guess how I define splitter in a sense is someone, let's say, who's below the 25th percentile GPA wise, right? Like I said, sometimes you just can't change that, but maybe above the medium when it comes to the LSAT. Are those students, how would you classify those students? And are those students, are they even likely to get a scholarship, or are they just lucky to get in, period? Like, hey, there's no scholarship consideration since you're below this area, you're above this area. Just curious, yeah.
Well, splitters often make up the majority of students that get into law schools. They are likely to, or there is a possibility that they will get a scholarship offer. It is unlikely that their scholarship offer is going to be like a full ride or close to a full ride, but it does not mean that there will not be money given to them. There are a few other things that come into play with splitters as well. So some schools offer both need-based scholarships, or they take need into consideration when offering scholarships, as well as merit. And so if you're a splitter who has greater need indicated in your application, you probably will get offered more scholarship money than someone who has the same numbers as you without that, need indicated in their application. And so there are a few other factors that come into play too with splitters, but they are not necessarily foreclosed from getting any scholarship offers. So splitters oftentimes do get scholarship packages as well. It probably is unrealistic to expect a full tuition scholarship though, if you are a splitter.
Right, no, that makes sense. And kind of parsing on the same kind of topic that we talked before, but just applying it here, which is, even if let's say someone's a splitter with the 25th percentile and then 75th percentile, they're above that, it would still kind of be around that same thing, right? Where the scholarship may not be full, but something may be offered depending if you are looking to get in. Maybe.
So believe it or not, schools are actually mostly concerned about their 50th percentile. And so not to say that the 75th percentile does not matter, but what schools are trying to maintain is that 50th percentile number. And so it's still possible that if you are at the 75th percentile, that you will get more money offered to you than someone who's at the 50th percentile. But that number that schools are trying to maintain, because it's the number that impacts rankings, is that 50th percentile number. And so it kind of, I don't want to say it doesn't matter as much where you are in variation to that, but like that 50th percentile number is the number that schools are really trying to get.
Okay, no, and I appreciate you clarifying that, because I even myself, I was kind of ignorant as to that as well. So I appreciate you clarifying, like, hey, where you're really trying to get is a 50%. After that, you're talking about maybe marginal returns, I guess, for lack of a better term. in a certain sense. So no, that clarifies a lot of things. No, thank you so much for that. One thing I was curious as well, sort of related to this topic, but kind of different as well, is for students in terms of the application process. What are some do's and don'ts that you've in your experience that you've seen? Maybe when it comes to resumes or even the personal. Well, I guess we'll start out the personal statement, right? That's the meat of the, I guess, the non-quantitative aspect. What are do's and don'ts for personal statement? Things that you've seen that were good and things that you see like, hey, this is just, don't do this.
Yeah, I think the biggest do for your personal statement is do make sure that by the time an admissions officer is done reading your personal statement, that they have a sense of why you want to go to law school. And so you do not need to start your personal statement off by saying, I want to go to law school because, but just by virtue of writing about whatever it is that you write about. Let's say that you are somebody who is moved by environmental injustice and you want to do something about that someday, or say that you are someone who doesn't necessarily know what type of law you want to practice, but you realize you want to be a lawyer after witnessing this travesty that happened, in the news a couple of months ago or a year or two ago. Whatever it is that is motivating and propelling you to want to go to law school, that is probably what your personal statement needs to be about. But by the time an admissions officer is done reading your personal statement, that is what they need to know, like why it is that you want to go to law school. Some don'ts, I recommend that okay, well, this is a do, but also a don't. So do honor page limits. So don't, disregard any rules that a school has with regard to personal statements. If they say that, it needs to be 2 pages, do not try to play around and finagle with the margins. Do like regular margins, 12-point font, like standard, just standard everything. Also, I like to recommend to my clients, even if a school allows you to write a 3-page essay, I like to condense essays down to 2 pages. I think that for the most part, students should be able to get their essay down into 2 pages. It needs to be concise as possible. But also the reason I like 2-page essays is because not every school accepts a 3-page essay. And I think that you should be able to, give you the same essay to every single school. I personally don't like students to include a school's name in a personal statement. And so I don't like for students to say, I really want to go to ABCD law school for this reason. There have been a few times when I've seen a student do it well, but more often than not, it really doesn't add significant value to an essay, if any value to an essay. And so I recommend just not doing it at all. Most students that get into law school did not write anything specific about the school in their personal statement, and that's okay. If you are someone who really wants to include specific information about a school, something that's motivating you to go to the school, check with the school, see if they allow you to submit optional essays. So a why XYZ school essay tends to be, in my point of view, a bit better to do instead of, trying to include something school specific in your personal statement. Make sure your personal statement is personal. And so I know that sometimes family members or friends can motivate us to want to become lawyers, which is perfectly fine. But your personal statement should not be all about, your mom and her upbringing. Like, it needs to be personal. It needs to be about you. And so really be careful about that. If, your motivation for going to law school is somebody else's story, you need to make that as personal as possible. Let me see what else. I think those are probably the biggest ones. Make sure that someone else reviews your personal statement for you. Oftentimes when we're writing, we know what we want to say and we know what we think we're saying, but like our brain tricks us to where there are errors or we don't see what's on paper in the same way that we would if it was a fresh set of eyes. And so make sure that someone else reads your personal statement for you and gives you feedback. Expect to do multiple drafts of your personal statement. You probably won't get it right the first time. Be okay with people kind of ripping it apart and restructuring it and telling you, this isn't actually a story you need to tell, etc. So be open to that and do give yourself enough time. I would say a couple of weeks, maybe a month at minimum, to really revamp and put together a really great personal statement.
Nice. And one thing, no, I appreciate you kind of going down. I was taking some notes on some of the things you were saying. One thing I was interested about, because you talked about, I guess, the personal statement being personal, right? And one thing you always hear from a mission officer, like, hey, I know your grandfather is really cool and your grandma's really cool, but they're not coming to law school with you. So tell us more about yourself. On the other hand, as well, I also hear kind of don't give us kind of a resume cover letter, right? So I guess I was curious if you can kind of clarify from your previous experience how students should have framed a personal statement in terms of should you focus on one story and then go from there, or are there multiple ways? Because obviously there's only 2 pages, right? You can't really go in that depth, but as well, because when I think of 2 pages, for example, the reason why I asked is because I remember talking to some law school admission reps, and one thing they advise is, hey, your personal statement should be kind of like a job interview in a sense. You're interviewing, they're getting to know you. But at the same time, one thing that I was curious about is that, well, when you go to a job interview, typically it's a cover letter from a standpoint. They just want to hit certain points and go from there. So I guess that's a long-winded way of me saying, I guess, could you clarify for the personal statements how you advise students kind of approach that? Is it a one story thing and focus on that and type things in, or yeah?
Yeah, I can definitely answer that. So I'll start by saying it should not be a recital of your resume. So you kind of touched on that. It definitely should not be a recital of your resume. I like to recommend to students that your personal statement needs to be one theme and 1 or 2 topics max. So an overarching theme that ties everything together and a maximum of 2 topics. And so you should not be bouncing all over the place from like story to story to story. You can maybe fit into 2 stories, but if you can like focus on one story, that's probably, good or sufficient. But if you want to talk about multiple things, you can talk about your childhood, and then you can, fast forward to a protest you attended while in undergrad. So you can talk about 2 separate things, but you should not be talking about more than 2 different things, in my opinion. So try to have one overarching theme where everything is connected, but like two focal points max. And so that is usually my advice to students. Sometimes when I'm reviewing personal statements, I will actually count out for students how many different focus areas I saw, and like recommend that they limit that to 2, and kind of tell them which ones I think they should spend more time talking about, which ones they should consider deleting altogether, etc. But I do think that students do often make the mistake of thinking that they have to fit their whole life story into their personal statement, or that they have to tell a school everything about themselves, and they don't. And so just like you said, imagine that this is an interview. Not just imagine that this is an interview, imagine that this is an interview and you have 5 minutes to answer a very specific question. What is motivating you to want to go to law school? That is
Yeah.
what you are going to talk about in your personal statement.
Thank you. No, that clears things up a lot. I appreciate you for that. And one thing I on this follow up as well as his write notes, let's say if there was a sort of imaginary personal statement checklist, right? What are some things? And if you don't think of it in that way, you can say, hey, I don't think that's the way you should
I
think.
actually have a checklist on my website. And so
Okay. Okay. Maybe I
yeah,
might have
so
missed that part.
I actually have a personal statement rubric on my website. It is a free personal statement rubric. And what it does, it allocates points to, different things, like if you hit this. So did you have a overarching theme? Like was your sentence structure and like your flow and all that, was it good? And so that is definitely something that I recommend that anybody watching this consider checking out and downloading, because that will help you kind of stay on track with your personal statement. And it also attributes like points to different parts of the personal statement, so it kind of helps you understand like how important different aspects of your personal statement are in relation to each other. But yeah, some of the checklists are actually, I have it in front of me, some of the things on that checklist. Give me 1 second, I can
No
tell you.
problem. And while you're pulling that up, is that the anderson.thinkitfic.com? Is that
Yeah,
the one,
if you
right?
go to anderson.thinkific.com,
put it
in
in
the
the chat
top
as well.
right-hand corner, there should be a bar that lists like just different pages on my website, and one of them should say free personal statement rubric. And so the criteria that I have are, is there a key purpose? So in an easy to summarize way, did the applicant explain why they want to go to law school? Is there a theme? Did the applicant stick to 1 or 2 main topics? Sincerity, did the applicant come off as honest, sincere, vulnerable, and authentic? Personal, was the personal statement personal? Did the applicant avoid using cliches? Page limits, content, writing style, writing quality. And so that is something that people can find on my website to kind of utilize as they're grading their own personal statement, or as they're getting someone to grade their personal statement for them.
Awesome. No, that's really cool. You have that. Yeah, no, I looked through your website. I didn't see that portion before, so I'm glad I asked that, because because I was like, I'm not sure if this is sort of how I would frame this question, but I'm glad I asked it. Nice. No, really cool. Yeah, no, so I guess one question as well, I was curious as well. So a student had asked earlier, they want to know what advice you would give to people who are reapplying applicants, perhaps do's and don'ts from that aspect as well.
Yeah, so if you are reapplying to law school, something that I recommend doing, especially over the summer, is reaching out to law schools and asking them, if they have 10 or 15 minutes to go over your application with you, if they have a moment to tell you, what your areas of strength were, what things you should improve next year. Because during the summer, law schools aren't as busy and as swamped and as stressed out as they are come August. The summer is a really good time to really ask them, or maybe sometimes early fall actually is a good time too, but come later fall, September, October is probably too late. Admissions officers are traveling, recruiting, etc. But actually consider reaching out to a school and asking them if they can tell you, what you should do differently. Sometimes schools will tell you it's really your LSAT score that helped or that hurt you. Sometimes they'll tell you you should consider getting letters of recommendation from someone else. Sometimes they'll tell you, your personal statement, could be improved. And so schools often will take the time to sit down and talk to you if you ask. And so consider doing that. If a school is unwilling to sit down and talk to you and kind of explain to you, what areas of improvement, there are, I also offer that service. And so you can find that on my website too. I do a service where I ask you to send me basically everything that you sent to a school. I ask you to tell me what you know about your letters of recommendation, and I will sit down and review everything. And I will have a Zoom call with you to kind of go over what things I think are areas of improvement for you. And so, first step, reach out to the school. If you're unsuccessful there, reach out to me. But I do think that reapplying to law school is something that students shouldn't shy away from. I think that sometimes students feel scared about reach or applying to schools again, but really having a good sense of where you went wrong last time is really the best first step.
And I see, and like Rose said earlier, I remember that's the kind of like the pay as you can. Is that under that as well? Like pay what you can kind of in a way, or is that a free service, or how would that
That
work?
one is a $50 service. That one should be under one-on-one Q&A sessions. It probably is under document reviews as well. But for all my services, I do have that pay what you can policy in place. And so anytime someone's unable to afford a service or a course on my website, they can simply email me and we will chat through just what it is that they are able to pay, what makes more sense for them. And we will just set up a payment plan or just a reduced rate based on, their particular circumstance.
Nice, nice. I like that you leave it open for people who may not be able to have that, because as we know, access to resources, well, I can't say it causes people to be successful. It's definitely correlated with being successful. And I guess on that same topic, I guess I was going to ask for people, I guess tying into two. So we talk about, I guess, access and class and stuff like that. People want to write in a personal statement. How do you stay away from, because you mentioned earlier about being cliche, so people who come from a disenfranchised economic background, obviously some of their personal statement might be about how they were able to overcome that and lead into law school. At the same time, someone may not want to write that because they may feel maybe stereotypical, like I don't want to be the stereotypical XYZ. How do you
Yeah. So
recommend? Yeah.
yeah. So I personally don't consider that cliche.
Okay.
And so more so the things that I consider cliche are things like I wanted to be a lawyer my whole life. So something where you're saying something, but it doesn't really add much like probative value. Like it doesn't really tell me much about your whys or things like that. But yeah, if someone, and I get this often when people tell me that they're writing a personal statement about, let's say, a current event. So Trayvon Martin, for example, like they fear that a lot of people are writing about that because that's what has led several students of color to want to go to law school. But the same thing goes for students from a disadvantaged background. I personally don't think that that's cliche. I don't think that most admissions officers think that's cliche. What I do acknowledge though is that that background isn't always the reason that someone wants to go to law school. So you can have that background and want to go to law school because you want to be an entertainment lawyer and make lots of money that has nothing to do with your background. And so if you feel like that story doesn't fit for the purpose of your personal statement, you can consider writing a diversity statement. And your diversity statement can talk about things you've overcome, challenges you've encountered, etc. And so that's a really good place to work in that story. But I do think that if you have that story, you should not be ashamed to talk about it, to write about it. I think that it often can actually be beneficial to be willing to be vulnerable and share that story with officers and offices. And so I recommend sharing that story if you feel comfortable with it.
Nice. Okay, no, thank you. I appreciate you clearing that up. So sort of going forward, in terms of the law school, when people are considering law school, they consider our clinics as well. So I was curious, what factors would you recommend, or do people consider when they're applying to law school in terms of the clinics? Like, should that be a big factor for them? And also, too, as well, how would you say going forward, clinics shape what type of law you practice as well in the future?
Yeah, so I think the biggest thing that students should think about when they're determining their law schools is just post law school employability. And
Mm,
so, um, what is it that you need in order to be a competitive applicant when you are applying for legal jobs? And so, for example, if you know that you want to practice environmental law one day, then yes, a law school that has an environmental law clinic is going to make a huge difference for you. But maybe there is one school that has an environmental law clinic, and there's another school that doesn't have that clinic but has a lot of environmental law classes. So being able to take a whole bunch of environmental law classes may give you, just as good of a competitive edge as, that environmental law clinic would have. But, a school that has neither of those and has no environmental law classes, that probably isn't the best school for you because it doesn't necessarily, or it's possible that it doesn't necessarily give you the competitive edge that you need to argue to an employer that I am skilled in this area of law that I say I want to practice. And so clinics are one way that you can get skills in a specific area, but externships are another way. Just classworks and certificate programs in certain areas are other ways that you can get skills in a particular area. And so all of those things kind of weighed together, I think, are things that students should use to determine what school is best for them. And then also if you're a student that just does not know what type of law you want to practice, then yeah, it's possible that a school that has a whole bunch of clinics to where you can get, lots of hands-on experience, or a school that has a lot of curricular options may be best for you. But you could also be someone who knows that, like myself, that you don't want to practice law
right.
in the traditional sense. And so maybe clinics aren't as important to you. Maybe your certificate program in government affairs is more important to you, or maybe being able to do an externship where you work full-time in DC for a semester is more important to you. So it's kind of more so about what it is that you personally want to do after law school and what is going to help you build your resume while you're in law school.
Nice. And yeah, I think you actually touched upon one of the questions I'm going to ask next, which is, I guess, how versatile would you say the a law degree can be? And on that same topic, so I kind of preface your background in a sense. So sometimes we hear like, hey, there's too many lawyers out there. Don't need to necessarily go to law school. Of course, there's money involved at that aspect. So sort of it's a two-part question. So first of all, how versatile would you say the law degree could be? And also, too, what would you say the role of law or being a lawyer is as well?
Yeah, I personally think that a law degree is very versatile. I think that you find people in all sorts of industries with a law degree, either as a practicing attorney or in a job where, they have a JD advantage by having that law degree. They are more effective at their job. And so I think that if you are someone who really is interested in, getting a law degree, as long as you have a sense of clarity about what exactly it is that you want to do with it, you will probably be fine. I think that students that struggle with a law degree sometimes are the students that lack direction going into law school and just think that, a law degree is just a ticket to anything in life. And so kind of making sure that you have some sense of direction is important, but you can do
Mhm.
a whole lot with a law degree. And so I definitely think that um that is the case. At least that has been the case for me and for my peers. And I'm sorry, Solomon, what was the
No,
second
no
question?
problem. No, no, I know it was a lot. No, that was my fault. I should have asked it one at a time because they're two general questions. The second part was, what would you say the role of a lawyer is? And I guess on that same topic, why are lawyers needed?
So for me, the role of a lawyer is to be an advocate to change the world. And so um, I personally see lawyers as the people that, in many ways, are the architects of society. They are making the laws that we all abide by. Obviously, every legislator is not a lawyer, but then there are lawyers behind the scenes pushing things forward. The people that are drafting legislation for legislators often are lawyers. So they are the architects, or we are the architects of the world. We also are the ones that, create the rules that we all abide by the litigation that we do. We are the ones that write contracts and, hold people to rules. And so we, in many ways, are the, um, not just the architects, but also like the referees, I think, of society, which is a really
Mm.
important role. So yeah, that's kind of what I think about when I think of lawyers.
That's interesting. I like that. The referees of that. So, hey, that's a foul. I'm going to take it to
Yeah.
court to make sure you understand that's a foul. You're getting sued for that foul. You're getting fined. That makes sense. Actually, now you think from that standpoint. And you also have to know the rules of the game. As a lawyer, you have to know the rules of it. Okay, interesting analogy. Um, One thing, no, I appreciate you answering and clarifying those questions. One thing I was curious about, in terms of, I guess, being a lawyer like that, because for yourself, as you said, you mentioned, I was listening as you're speaking, you said you knew you didn't want to practice law at a certain point. And also the role you're doing now, as you expressed earlier in the interview, you didn't necessarily need a law degree, but the law degree did help.
Yeah.
So for yourself in particular, I'm curious, if you were to go back, would you still have gone through law school to get to the point you are now? And also, to, on that same topic, when did you know at what point you didn't want to practice?
Yeah, I absolutely would go back to law school. And I actually knew I didn't want to practice when I
Oh,
was
wow.
applying to law school.
Okay.
I knew I did not want to be in a courtroom. And so my personal statement actually talked a bit more about wanting to be um, kind of like what I said, like behind the scenes and influencing legislation and policies, but also recognizing that there was this whole language that I did not understand, like legislation and the way laws were written, and that I felt that the law was a language that I needed in order to navigate and be successful in this realm. So yeah, I knew going into law school that I wanted a different path, but I also 1000% would do it over again. Yeah.
Nice, nice. I'm going to circle back, because it's a question I forgot to ask earlier, kind of backtracking a little bit in particular. And I know you no longer represent UCLA, so I want to put something out there. But I was curious, when you were at UCLA, and things may have changed now, do you know for scholarships, if for most time, if people can, like, for example, the scholarship that you come in when you're 1L year, are you able to change that? Let's say you're 2L or 3L if you do better, or is the package whatever you get in your first year, that's it? There is no changing, and are they conditional?
Yeah, so I'm pretty certain at UCLA Law, you could not change your scholarship at any point. Um, the one exception, and this wasn't really an exception, but in addition to law school specific scholarships, sometimes bigger universities like UCLA was, they also have scholarships that like the main campus is providing to graduate students. And so there could be an instance where a student comes in their first year and they're getting, let's say, $60,000 a year. In their second year, instead of getting $60,000, it has gone down. And that's because your first year, you were getting an outside scholarship from like main campus. That was only for that first year and it wasn't for the next 2 years. And so that is the only instance that I can think of where a scholarship amount changed. But something that I will say about scholarships that I think matters a lot when students are thinking about what schools to go to is that all scholarships aren't created equally. So at a school like UCLA, for example, your scholarship is your scholarship. You do not have to maintain a certain GPA, or at least this was the case while I was there. You did not have to maintain a certain GPA to keep your scholarship. There was no threat looming over your head that if you're not the top of your class, you're going to lose this money. Whereas at some institutions, that is the case. You have to maintain a certain GPA to keep your scholarship, which usually means that schools can kind of anticipate in advance that, a lot of students are going to lose their scholarship. And so they have more scholarship money to offer the next batch of students. And it's kind of just this repeating cycle where I'm funding the incoming classes scholarships off of the students that lost their scholarship last year. And so that's something to kind of keep in mind that, if possible, you it is best to have a scholarship that is not dependent on a GPA, maintaining a certain GPA. And so that's just something to keep in mind as you're getting offers from different schools, just what kind of scholarship or what kind of requirements are attached to the scholarship offer.
Awesome, thank you. On the same topic of, I guess, scholarship offers, how do you let's say a student is fortunate and they have multiple offers from different schools. How do you respectfully negotiate, scholarship offers like, hey, this school gave me this amount of money, I still want to attend your school without being, too, yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I recommend that the biggest thing that students know when they are trying to negotiate scholarships is that they must be respectful and gracious at all times. And so that is important because the one thing that you do not want is you do not want to show up to a conversation hoping to negotiate a scholarship and you walk away not only without a new negotiated scholarship or a higher scholarship amount, but you
Mm.
also walk away without, your admissions decision. So you walk away with that being
Oh, wow.
rescinded. That's
Wow.
a really awful thing that can happen when
Wow.
conversations kind of disintegrate. So be professional, be polite, be respectful throughout all communications. But I think usually what helps students the most is being able to show schools that they have a similar, scholarship, or they have another scholarship offer from a similarly ranked school. That tends to be the most persuasive. So if you are trying to go to, let's say, a top 21 law school, a school that's ranked 121 probably isn't going to be as persuasive when you're negotiating your scholarship as a school that's ranked number 25. And so that's something important to know. And I do have on my website, I have an e-course on negotiating scholarships. And so that provides a template, it provides a spreadsheet to kind of track your scholarships, and it provides 10 tips on negotiating scholarships. And so I definitely recommend people check that out. But I do think that the biggest things that I want students to remember is to be gracious and be kind and professional, because again, I don't want that worst case scenario to come to pass for them.
Nice. Wow. What don't you have on your website? I mean, you have a lot of stuff. I thought I checked out a lot of stuff on your website, but apparently this is good though. I'm gonna check out more stuff. This is really cool, and we'll drop it the link again for those who just joined as well, and also email it out later. Yeah. So we are towards the top of the hour. I guess I was gonna ask one quick question. I really appreciate your time in this interview. Passing on information to folks like myself and other people who are interested in law school. The last question I'm going to ask is a very simple question, which is, I guess, what would you say makes a good lawyer, in particular? So, yeah.
Yeah, I think a good lawyer is someone that is just passionate about their craft, to be honest. So whatever type of law it is that you want to practice, I think that being intellectually curious is important in the legal realm. I think being a good writer is important in the legal realm. And I personally think that having people skills matters a lot in the legal realm. I mean, obviously, this is a profession where there are winners and losers, like quite literally, and there are adversarial like interactions and relationships, but to the extent that you are able to get along with other people, it really can move you far in the profession, especially since oftentimes the people across the aisle from us we have to work with, we have to be civil with, and so having people skills is really something that I don't always think that people going into the legal profession know is so important. I think that lawyers are seen as combative and just great debaters, but I think having people skills is really something that is an art that lawyers have to, craft and develop.
Awesome. Thank you. So yeah, we are at the top of the hour. Thank you so much for your time. Is there any, I'm going to post a link for your website. Is there anywhere else people can find you or reach out to you for information, LinkedIn, et cetera, whatever, anything you want to post?
Yeah, the next best place to find me is on Instagram. And so my IG handle is just ask Akeisha, Akiesha. And so I respond to DMs, I post free information. And so that's really the next best place to find me.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And you have a nice one. We really appreciate you.
Thank you. You as well. Thanks for doing this.
Thanks for tuning into the show. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already to be notified of new episodes as I release them. And feel free to reach out if you need anything at all as you move forward with your prep. I'm happy to help however I can. In the meantime, I wish you all the best and take care.